in Connecticut, you actually, in terms of the number of events, they're certainly dwarfed by, what happened elsewhere in the country. By the way, this is a fun fact. The most Revolutionary War battles fought were actually in South Carolina, over 200. A lot of people think of the American Revolution as happening in Boston and around here, but really, after the shot heard around the world, nothing else happens in Massachusetts. You have two major events that happen in Connecticut, but I'm going to share one with you that's going to be really fun. That there's a whole new school of historiography that's emerging with this, and I know the guy who's really spearheading it, and it's fantastic. So, real quick, in 1777, when Tryon invades Fairfield, remember, it's not Westport until 1835. Same thing, Weston was carved out of what Fairfield was.
I mean, Fairfield gets burned, which I always thought is what turned everything else around.
Oh yeah, that's the second raid, and they're connected. The first one, Tryon is the governor of New York, and by the way, there's Tryon Park right on the West Side Highway. He was also the previous governor of North Carolina, so he's a big deal. New York is the loyalist stronghold in the entire colonies in the war. That's why the British based their operations there. But what does he do? What's interesting is, and I'll link this to what's known as the Whaleboat Wars, and I hope I can do this in the time remaining today. But what happened was the American Revolution was a civil war, and more than anything else. And the American Civil War was more like a revolution because of the Industrial Revolution, right? But this is a civil war, and it's more Americans died per capita in the American Revolution than any other conflict. Combat, were relatively low by modern standards, of course, but just the disease, the related stuff. But what happened was, if you were a patriot, I think it tended to be patriot. If you were a patriot, and you lived in Long Island, for example, you would then come to Fairfield. If you were a loyalist and lived in Fairfield, you fled to Long Island. And I'll get back to that later. But what Tryon did was, Long Island was a scene of a lot of intrigue. So is Fairfield, Connecticut. The greatest spy ring of the Revolution comes, the Culper spy rings, out of Fairfield, Connecticut. But what Tryon does is he raises the Prince of Wales volunteers. They're loyalists. They're the ones who come from Long Island, along with the oldest single infantry regiment in the British Army. That is significant. That's who's on this raid in 1777 in April. It's the oldest storied infantry unit in the entire history of the British Army to today, along with a loyalist vanguard. And they conduct a search and destroy raid that was so successful, it's been taught at the British, Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, off and on since then, as the way to do a classic hit and run raid. What they do is they land at Campo Beach, they march 66 miles round trip up to Danbury, where they destroy a bunch of military stores, including many of the tents that were supposed to be going to Valley Forge. So really what's interesting about that raid is it materially contributes to the fact that Washington was shorthanded at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, because the tents he should have had had been destroyed by the British. And what's really interesting is when the British are on their way back, okay, so they've been here 24 hours, maybe 36. And in that time frame, the local militia around here completely galvanizes, to the extent that the best general on both sides of the war, literally, a guy by the name of Benedict Arnold rides from New Haven, Connecticut, gets to Ridgefield as the British are beginning to return after, again, about 36 hours there, engages in an incredibly pitched battle where his horse is shot under him. It's amazing he doesn't die. You have Worcester, who's killed at that. He is, what's interesting is a General Worcester, he's now like this barely red plaque on the side of the road. But if you look at his history, Worcester probably would have become one of the most greatest Revolutionary War generals that there were. And on the way back to Campo, there's a couple of other, full-pitched skirmishes. The British make it back down here, but meet incredible resistance around Campo Beach. But they're basically able to get in and out of here in 3 days in a completely successful mission. However, Tryon writes, this is a raid that's written about in the London Times. Tryon writes that the opposition was so fierce that he essentially recommended not to go into the interior of Connecticut ever again, and they never did. Now, in 1779, what happens? You've got a series of 4 raids led by Tryon again. They hit and burn, New London was a little bit later, but they burn New Haven, they burn Norwalk, they burn Fairfield. Fairfield is 95% destroyed during this raid. And why did they come? These were just coastal raids because they knew if they went into the interior again, that they would face intense guerrilla conflict. So again, going back to that first raid, they learned their lesson. That's how significant it was. And that's one of Arnold's first major appearances in the American Revolution. And he's a genius at it. He's brilliant at it. So what are in the second raid, what happens? Tryon comes, they land at Penfield, but they also land, the majority of the troops land at on the Old Mill River. They arrive, they begin to burn every farmhouse that they can. Most of the destruction is done by Hessian soldiers, however. Tryon had left orders as they retreated not to burn any more stuff, but the Hessians, remember these are Germans, they're far away from home. They have been in this strange land. They're seeing their friends get killed, and they've had about enough of it. And so as they retreat, they're the last that leave Fairfield. They begin to burn the place left and right. But what's fascinating about Fairfield, and this is one of Washington considered it the breadbasket of the American Revolution. That's a huge quote. And the reason was the cattle that were here. They were very desirable by Washington's troops. And so what Tryon was trying to do was destroy their supply lines. But another thing, and this is even more important, was Washington was up in Westchester with his army, and Tryon was trying to pull Washington out of Westchester County to come engage him along the Connecticut coastline, and Washington didn't bite. So this was between most of the casualties, one historian has said, that occurred in Connecticut was actually in the last 2 years of the war, and even after the war, into like 1783. And the whaleboat wars will go back to those loyalists that are now in Long Island that used to be from Fairfield and vice versa. So the loyalists knew where their Fairfield neighbors' cattle were, where their gold was. So what you had were these raids with, they were so ferocious that the British Navy called Long Island Sound the Devil's Belt during the American Revolution. And so these loyalists would come back to Fairfield, kidnap people, slaughter cattle, burn houses. Whaleboats were about, they could be rowed by about 25 men. There was prows on both ends. They didn't have a stern, so you could, move them around. They're really maneuverable. And likewise, the Fairfielders would go over to Long Island. In one raid, they came back with several thousand sheep. So you had this internecine civil war occurring on Long Island Sound that was completely brutal. And actually, in many ways, pound for pound in terms of viciousness, cruelty, material damage, and the amount of people killed, you're talking about this might be the most significant action of the American Revolution in its entirety in Connecticut.